before. I guess I didn't feel like I was worthy. Working with people in Bolivia, the Guarani, talking about suffering, what did I know about suffering when they suffered far more? And even in this church, I recognize that there are people here that suffer far more than I ever have. And yet, I think it became clear to me as I was studying the book of Job that it doesn't matter if you feel like you've suffered a lot or little. We shouldn't be comparing our suffering to one another. We all have suffered. Some of us are suffering, and we all probably will suffer again. And so this book is very applicable to us. I guess I also didn't want to become a modern day illustration of suffering. Maybe the Lord would all of a sudden make me that, but I trust in Him. So if you have your Bibles or your phones, let's look at for the passage in Job chapter 1. And what I'd like to try to accomplish this morning is to see how we can suffer well. And so let's see, first of all, what Job, who he was. Job chapter 1, verse 1 to 5 says, "In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yokes of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes, and on their birthdays they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, 'Perhaps my children had sinned and cursed God in their hearts.' This was Job's regular custom." So he was blameless. Now, don't mistake blameless for sinless, because Job, like us, sinned. But when you confess regularly your sin, you can be considered blameless. He was upright, feared God, shunned evil. He had a wife, 10 children, and he had a lot of animals. What a guy. Now, we're going to skip that passage, the part where God and Satan have this conversation, because in some way, I want us to kind of get the feeling of, what did Job actually know about his situation? He didn't know about that conversation that happened. He was blinded. So let's continue on in chapter 1 and picking it up in verse 16 to 22. "One day, when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, 'The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby. The Sabeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' And while he was speaking, another messenger came and said, 'The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, 'The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on their camels and made off with them. They put the servant to the sword, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, 'Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house. Then suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' At this, Job got up, tore his robe, shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, Naked I have come from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. So this morning, I'd like to... Are our slides still working? There we go. We're going to look at 3 phases. They're not consecutive. They kind of meld together a little bit in the book of Job, but I've divided them a little bit into 3 phases. And we're going to start off with the trusting phrase. So Job gets all this bad news. One servant after another comes and gives him this awful news of him losing everything. But he had this great attitude. All the tragedies produced worship. Did you catch that in the last part? When he fell to the ground in worship. So when shocking news comes to you, maybe it's a constable at your door saying there's an accident, or you get the test results back from the doctor and it's not good. What do we do when we receive bad news? It's going to come to us at some time. Will we have the same attitude as Job? We fall down and worship. Worship God. You see, we need to be preparing ourselves for that. We need to be ready. In fact, I love the team up here. I think the stage is getting a little bit small for everybody. Maybe we'll end up having more people up here than down here. Worship is a wonderful thing, isn't it? And our Sunday morning worship is not just for us to sing praises here. It's actually worship practice. We are practicing on Sunday what we might need during the week. We might need those songs when the hard times come. You see, there's a verse that says, a good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. I had a colleague, a fellow missionary, that he had a phrase that I never forgot. He says, you're full of what spills out of you when you get bumped. You see, missionaries, like many of us, gets a lot of bumps. Somebody says something wrong, somebody cuts you off in traffic, whatever. We get bad news. What comes out of us? What's the first thing that comes out of your mouth? Because that's usually indicative of what's in your heart. May we have praise in our heart that just bubbles up when bad news comes to us. So that's what Job did. What a great example. He was trusting the Lord. And then his wife came over to encourage him. Job, whoa, she was a work of art, wasn't she? She said in chapter 2, verse 8, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Now, we have to cut Job's wife a little bit of slack here. She lost her 10 kids as well. I mean, she might not have cared for the 500 donkeys, but she cared about her kids. And she lost them. Maybe what was in her heart that bubbled up was cursing. And she encouraged Job to do the same thing. But thankfully, Job resisted that. What did he say? Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all of this, Job did not sin in what he said. So Job chose to bless and believe rather than blaspheme God. You see, God is mixing all kinds of things in our lives. It's a little bit like a recipe, a mixing bowl. And I've watched Carolyn bake all kinds of things, and I sometimes stand there and I wonder, hey, she's making a cake mix. And yeah, she puts in flour and cocoa and stuff like that. Why does she put in salt? Vinegar or oil. That's not going to taste good. But it's like God knows the right recipe. He knows what we need for our salvation and our sanctification. He's mixing that all together because he's so wise. You know, we often quote Romans 8:28, and that says, "For we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him." God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. You know, that's an easy verse to quote when everything's going well, isn't it? Do we also think about that when things are just going bad and we get bad news? We get that phone call. God works all things for good. The end result is going to be a wonderful cake in our lives. But sometimes the ingredients that get put into that hurt. You know, we had a guest speaker here a couple weeks ago, Rob McLeod. He had some great things to say that I called him later on. I said, can we get together? I need to get these quotes from you. And he shared 3 of them, and they're similar, but I thought they were really good. I'll read them. The Lord is more interested in the success or maturity of your character than he is in the perceived success of your circumstances. Also, God will not sacrifice the maturation of your character merely to improve your circumstances. And God makes us into godly men and women by taking us through a humbling process that fundamentally changes the way we think. Aren't those true? What's important to God? Often my prayers are, God, I just pray that everything goes well today. Just smooth sailing, no bumps in the road. And yet God is more concerned about my maturity, my spiritual growth, my dependence on him. So, the second phase, I called the questioning phase. You see, when we're suffering, what is the 3-letter word, the question that we often need to know so badly? Why? Why? Let's look at Job's friends. This is where they come in. Job chapter 2, 11 to 13 says, Then Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him. They set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. Now, here again, it seems like Job's friends got a bad rap, didn't they? But look at that. They see their friend in distress, and they did something. They left their homes. They went to sit with him 7 days, 7 nights. They didn't say a word. I mean, sometimes when we see someone in distress, we might send a little I care heart on Facebook and figure that's enough. But these friends actually left, and they stayed with him without passing judgment for 7 days, without even speaking. Great friends. But I bet the whole time they were thinking, what did Job do to deserve this? Why did this happen? Why? Now, Job's friends all figured out why that happened. In fact, they gave 8 speeches, those friends, in like from chapters 4 to 25, and we won't read it all because we'd be here all morning or all day. But they gave these speeches and they explained the conclusion they had come to. Either Job failed or God failed. And they figured God hadn't failed. It must be Job. It must be that Job sinned. We've been going through this devotional. I think Bev has too with Carolyn, and I participate as well. And it's called Through the Word. It's on the Bible. No, they have their own app. Anyway, Chris Langham said that these 3 friends had kind of a kindergarten theology of God. Their thought process was a little bit like we might think of karma. They maybe reduced God to that, where good things happen to good people when you do good, and bad happens when you do bad. And sometimes even us Christians start to think that always happens, that good happens to good and bad happens to bad people. Where it breaks down, though, is that what do you do with someone who's really good, but bad things happen to them? In fact, that's often the excuse that some atheists throw at Christians. If God is all-loving and he's all-powerful, how could he permit all this suffering for good people? Why do bad things happen to good people? It doesn't make sense. And they try to use that to disprove the existence of God. Well, what is our response to that? How do we deal with that? There aren't good reasons, and we can't just judge somebody who, when bad things are happening to them, we can't just say, this is why it happened. I'm reminded of Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. It says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Isn't that true? We don't know why God brings suffering into our lives. We can't give an easy answer, and we shouldn't put God in a box and say, this is how God always acts. In fact, after all those discourses of Job's friends, what did God say to them? He said in Job 42:7, I am angry with you, Eliphaz, and your 2 friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me. And that's so true. They hadn't spoken the truth about him. But Job, sadly, fell into this trap of questioning God as well. It wasn't just the friends, it was Job. He started to ask, why have you made me your target? Why? Even when God spoke directly to Job in the whirlwind, he never explained the reason for his sufferings. I mean, really, Job was wondering, why is this happening to me? What have I done? Why are you disciplining me like this? You know, I think it would have shortened the book of Job substantially if God just would have come out and said, you know, Satan and I had this chat and this is why this has happened. Wow. But he never did. And I wonder, the reason we have such a long and complicated book of Job, I wonder if it's because suffering is often long and complicated as well. It's not short and it's not simple, oftentimes. Terminal or chronic illness, a wayward child. There's all kinds of suffering that spans a long time, and it's difficult. So we need to remember that Job never did receive a why or an answer to his why questions. In fact, Job was likely one of the first books of the Bible written, and so Job didn't even have the Word of God to really understand the character of God and understand how much God loved him. But Romans 15:4 says, "For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the Scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope." That's why we have the book of Job. That's why we have the entire Bible now, so that we might have hope. So Job started off great. He went through this time of worship and trust God, but then he slipped into this rut of questioning God. Why me? Why is this happening? And after months of suffering, Job's view, though, started to deteriorate. And he started to actually accuse God, not just questioning him. And his bitterness caused him to lose his perspective of who God was. Look at Job 9:17 and 18. It says, "He would crush me with a storm and multiply my wounds for no reason. He would not let me catch my breath, but would overwhelm me with misery." That's how Job felt, that there was no purpose to his suffering, and that it was like a wave after wave was crashing over him, and he couldn't even catch his breath. Maybe you sometimes feel like that too. He also said in verse 23, when a scourge brings sudden death, he mocks the despair of the innocent. Does he? This is how far Job slipped into this attitude of accusation. His fruitless quest to understand the reason for his suffering led Job not only to doubt God's motives, but he started to accuse him. He's talking like a fool, accusing God. Ezekiel 33:11 says, "As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live." So if God doesn't take pleasure in the death of the wicked, how much less would he take pleasure in his sons and daughters suffering? We shouldn't question God's love, justice, and wisdom. You know, we need to remember God's goodness in the midst of the storm. Do you remember Jesus when his disciples and him were crossing the sea in that boat, and Jesus is so tired he's actually sleeping in the boat, and his disciples wake him up? What did they say to Jesus when they were terrified? They said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drowned? Don't you care?" Jesus cares, doesn't he? God sees and he does care. I find comfort in Psalm 56:8. It says, "You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in a bottle. Are they not in your book?" God doesn't only care, he records. He keeps track of the times that you're tossing in bed when you can't sleep because you're thinking about a hard time that you're going through. He puts your tears in a bottle. They don't go to waste. He cares. Many of you know Hans Elgeby. I remember when his wife Wendy had died from cancer, and I got together with him thinking that I might encourage him. In fact, it was the other way around. He came to my office and he encouraged me, and he was so upbeat. He left me a little business card. It wasn't with his name on it. It was with this quote, and it says, "God is too good to be unkind, too wise to be mistaken. And when you cannot trace his hand, you can always trust his heart." I left that card by my monitor at the office because I needed that reminder often. Sometimes when you can't trace God's hand, you can still trust his heart. He does care. It was during one of our furloughs, actually. We were just ready to head back to Bolivia, and Lena Fraze, Jake Fraze's first wife, was struggling. She was going through her chemo. She'd lost her hair. It didn't look like she was going to make it much longer, and Carolyn and I went to visit them. And I remember the phrase, you probably have heard it from him as well. I think he said it often. In acceptance, there is peace. In acceptance, there is peace. This would have been good for Job to hear. It's good for us to hear as well. So, our third phase, he moved into despairing. And he started to use these phrases, if only. I mean, it started pretty early after his tragedies. If only I wasn't even born. If only I had just been a stillborn. If only I had just not even seen the light of day. If only. Job 14:13, if only you would hide me in the grave and conceal me till your anger has passed. Job just wanted to die. He didn't feel like there was any reason to keep going. Maybe we've all had these thoughts from times to times. We think, if only I wasn't having this health problem. If only my child would accept me. If only we had more money. If only the lightning hadn't hit that dry timber and burned the fire, and the wind blew exactly, changed course, and burned our cabin. I'm sure my cousins often thought, if only their girls had seen that semi coming when they crossed the 75 highway and died. If only. Job says in chapter 3:2 and 3, if only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sands of the sea. No wonder my words have been so impetuous. When Job questioned or said, if only, he's really living in the past. And he's frustrated because you can't change the past. There's nothing you can do to change what's already happened. And it makes you frustrated when you look back. If only. He was caught in this perpetual cycle of if only reason. You know, if we contrast that with what Chris read this morning about Paul, the Apostle Paul, I mean, Paul sure suffered a lot. 5 times he received 40 lashes minus one. 3 times he was beaten by rods. Once he was pelted with stones. 3 times shipwrecked. And he spent the night and the day in the open ocean. I mean, if there was someone else in the Bible that had suffered, it was the Apostle Paul. But there's a huge difference here. Paul has a hope that Job didn't have. And I won't have to read it all, but 2 Corinthians 4 talks about, therefore, we do not lose hope. And I wanted to know what that therefore was there for. And so I look back, and it says in verse 6, God has made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. So that's the reason to not lose heart, is because God gave us the light of the knowledge of God's glory. And so that's why we are wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. I mean, here Job is talking about the weight of his what ifs. And Paul is saying our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us. What's the difference? He's seeing that this will pass, and he has a hope because he has the scriptures and he knows about Jesus. Job continues in his despair in chapter 9. If only there was someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me so that his terror would frighten me no longer. So Job is longing for this mediator, someone to redeem him, someone to remove this rod. And then he musters all the courage and hope that he can. And I think it was prompted by the Holy Spirit. And Job penned these beautiful words, or he said them at least. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. Wow. He has hope because he's looking forward. He's looking toward his mediator, a redeemer. Now, if you could travel back to Job's day, if you could sit with Job in that pile of ash, watch him scrape his sores, and he's hoping for a redeemer, what would you tell him? You would tell him, I know who that is. He's coming. His name is Jesus. He will wipe away every tear. He will make all things right. You're waiting for him. And how often do we cross paths with people that are suffering that don't know about Jesus? They're suffering without the knowledge of Christ. And we need to tell them. We have the answer. We know who that Redeemer is. Do we share Christ with others? You see, Job didn't get anywhere asking why. He needed to change one of the letters in that word. Take out the Y and replace it with an O. What do you get? He needed to start thinking about who that Redeemer was, who his Savior was. And that would give him hope. Job later said, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Listen to this. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Is that what suffering does? It brings us from maybe a hearing knowledge of who God is to an intimate understanding of who God is. I think sometimes God strips away the things that we love, the good things even in our lives. He might strip away health. He might strip away some of the things that we own. Why? Maybe He's wanting to be everything that we need without those things. We can get to know Him so much more intimate. I love spending time with parents who've maybe lost a child because they seem to know God in such a more intimate way. Or people that have had chronic illness, they trust in God much more than we often do. I want to close with a video. We've had colleagues in the mission. Phil and Sylvia raised their family in Italy, and they were actually a pastor to the missionaries after Carolyn's dad left that position. But their daughter, Charity, was just like Derek and Kirsten, two little girls, good health, but her health was taken away. And I just want, Wayne, if you can show that video, and then we'll prepare for communion after that.
Oh, lift your eyes to heaven, see the Holy One eternal. Behold the Lord of majesty, exalted in his temple, as sin